Here's a photo of me when I was a kid, December 25th of 1999, gripping onto a Nintendo 64 and a copy of Pokemon Snap. By then, Pokemania was at its peak, and the Pokemon Company had just about every single child on Earth captivated by their IP. This photo is the only reason why I know that my first video game console was the N64, and that my first console game was Pokemon Snap. 20 some years later, having lived a quarter of a lifetime, I decided to return to Pokemon Snap. To me, unsurprisingly, it held up. There's an inherent joy that comes with photographing little guys in their natural habitat. However, when I took my shots to Professor Oak, he provided some critique that managed to worm its way unreasonably far under my skin.
Wait!
I couldn't help but think, why does Professor Oak feel he has the right to give anyone photography advice? It's my understanding that he's a professor in Pokemon biology, not photography. At this point in my personal life, I had about a decade of professional design experience under my belt, as well as some experience as a hobby photographer. I knew about the rule of thirds, the golden ratio, the rule of odds, leading lines, etc., but I had never heard of the subject has to be in the middle of the frame. Even if you remove Professor Oak's critique, the video game Pokemon Snap encourages the player to capture center-weighted compositions through its gameplay mechanics. When you hover your reticle over a Pokemon, it blinks red. And when you photograph a Pokemon for the first time, you get a very satisfying blink sound, in addition to seeing the name of the Pokemon. Even Pokemon Snap's marketing tactics ask its players to compose shots in this specific way. In the late 90s, right after Pokemon Snap was released, Nintendo held a competition called Take Your Best Shot, where kids could go to Blockbuster, or Lawson's in Japan, and print their favorite shots and mail them into Nintendo. The winner of this extremely 90s sweepstakes would get an all-inclusive trip to Australia for an animal safari tour. Reportedly, so many kids sent in the same exact photograph of Mew, which would net you the highest possible score in the game, that they asked them all to write an essay about how much they love Pokemon as a way to assign a winner to the contest. I can't imagine a more soulless way to reward a child's creativity. Now, before you post your YouTube comment, I can see why the Pokemon being in the middle of the frame makes sense from a gameplay perspective. It's like a non-violent headshot. If you have to assign points in Pokemon Snap, it makes sense that an accurate shot should net you a higher score. I guess the bigger question is, how can you put a numeric value on creative work? Maybe in Pokemon Snap's case, instead of judging on whether or not the Pokemon is in the center of the frame, you could instead assign more points if there's an odd number of Pokemon in the shot, to follow the rule of odds, which is a much more established photography rule. The game could desaturate the photo, check the values of the lights and darks, to ensure that there's a good amount of contrast in the shot. Now, does this sound as lifelessly prescriptive as Professor Oak's center of the frame advice? Yup, and that's because it is. Photography rules, such as the rule of odds, exist as guidance, kind of like a suggestion, as a way to create traditionally effective compositions. They aren't laws, much to Professor Oak's disappointment, and many photography greats actually came to be through breaking the rules. In the 1940s and 50s, photographers like William Eggleston and Ernst Haas were essentially laughed at by their contemporaries for using any color at all in their street photography. The technology had existed for decades, but at that time, color photography wasn't taken seriously as an art form due to its association with commercial photography. If Pokemon Snap was released in 1952, it'd probably look like this. Here's Haas's La Suerte de Capa, shot in Spain in 1956. You can see Haas captured the movement of the scene by overexposing the shot, leading to the dreamy motion blur we see here. When Haas sent his film in to develop, the technician told him that there seemed to be an issue with the film and that the shots are unusable. Professor Oak might have said, the photo should have been taken at a higher shutter speed. It'd be a much better shot if you didn't expose for so long. Saul Leiter was known to intentionally shoot on expired Kodachrome film. His rule break provided a unique color story that carried throughout his images. His work is almost immediately identifiable. Now, at home you might be thinking, well, Saul Leiter and Ernst Haas were street photographers. Do IRL wildlife photographers place more value on a center-weighted composition? As I did some research, I found that the Natural History Museum in London runs an annual contest for Wildlife Photographer of the Year. As I scrolled through 2023's shortlist of 25 shots up for nomination, I saw wonderful images that showed nature's warmth, humor, apathy, and beauty. Here's the winning photograph. So, how do you gamify a Pokemon photography game in a way that doesn't stifle the player's creativity? I think you don't. Let the players break these photography rules if they feel like they shot an image worth capturing. If you really want to have progression, you could gate new areas by the quantity of Pokemon you've taken photos of, instead of the subjective quality of them. Season, A Letter to the Future, asks its players to use a camera to document the world around them, but doesn't judge the player for which moments they want to capture, or how they want to compose their shots. This gives the player a real sense of ownership in their scrapbook, knowing that no two would consist of the same photographs. The Dream Pokemon Snap game would also follow Season's lead and take the player off the rails and into an open world, where they could be free to explore and shoot from any angle. You could create a portfolio of all of your favorite shots, which, to Pokemon Snap's credit, you could always do, and end the game with your work in a museum. If 2030's new Pokemon Snap really wants to outdo itself, it could have a hard mode, where you can manually set your ISO, shutter speed, and aperture settings to get the right exposure for the shot. I had to do some real introspection to understand why Professor Oak's feedback irked me so badly. Maybe it's something that anyone who works in a creative field can empathize with, being given direction from a person who has little experience in what they're talking about. This frustration probably exists in all areas of work. But specifically, there's this inevitable trade-off that occurs when you start mixing art with work. I'd imagine that this isn't limited to design or photography, but also with writing, game design, music composition, whatever it is. There's a graphic design is my passion to graphic design is my prison pipeline that beats down the best of us. Personally, I cope through taking a deep breath and reminding myself to not get too invested in my 9 to 5. Maybe it makes sense to take the shots that Professor Oak wants you to take while you're on the clock and keep a personal scrapbook for the work you find creatively fulfilling. After you capture a shot of Mew on the Rainbow Cloud level, and before credits start rolling on Pokemon Snap, Professor Oak says, "Thank you. This is all because of your hard work. It was so nice to find a photographer as good as you." Which is then hilariously undercut by an abrupt, "See you." Oddly enough, hearing this piece of sincerity from Professor Oak did feel pretty nice, even if I was salty about his backseat creative direction. Maybe he just overstepped the boundary line in trying to be helpful. Here are some of my favorite shots from my Pokemon Snap playthrough. Feel free to like or subscribe or leave a comment or whatever. Thanks for watching. Appreciate it.